Hi everyone, my name is Augustine, and today I'm going to briefly go over Eric Robert Rudolph and his connection to religion and violence. My first encounter with this individual was through our class reading Terror in the Mind of God, and was further talked about in our class lecture Christian Religious Terrorism. So, who is Eric Rudolph? Eric Rudolph is known for the bombings that he executed in various locations throughout the US. These included abortion clinics in Birmingham and Atlanta, a lesbian bar in Atlanta, and the Atlanta Olympics in 1996, though he wasn't arrested until 2003. Some central themes and characteristics that can be seen in this individual are a Christian identity slash central text, defensive action slash just war, idealizing the past, and dominion theology. So, what is a Christian identity? The Christian identity is a movement that is based on the racial supremacy and biblical law. It is an ideology that was formed by extreme individuals that believe that European ancestry could be traced back to the lost tribes of Israel that were mentioned in the Old Testament. They were known as the lost tribes because of the attacks they encountered from the Hittites, Assyrians, and Babylonians. And many of those who were part of the lost tribes fled would flee to Europe, propagating the idea that white Europeans are the true Israelis and seeing other groups as false Christians. This movement also revolved around the central text known as the Turner Diaries. So, how does defensive action and just war related to the attacks of Eric Rudolph? Well, with modernity taking place in the US, a product of that was a more diverse society where people were capable of being themselves, and that meant people were given more choices to do what they want around the country. But to Rudolph, it was a threat to society, hence the attacks he made, and found those attacks as justified, which relates to the idea of just war, an argument that a violence act can be morally justified if more lives are saved. This can be seen in his statements regarding the attacks on abortion clinics, believing it was his duty to act. Here I have some quotes. I'm going to read the first two where he says, I believe that abortion is murder. I also believe that force is justified in an attempt to stop it. You have a right, the responsibility, and the duty to come to the defense of the innocent when the innocent are under assault. Clearly showing the defensive action he believes he needs to take to protect these unborn children. How this relates to idolizing the past? Well, this idea takes place when a group of people, or in this instance, a individual feels threatened by what's happening to his community or nation in this case. To relieve the stress, they tend to look back at a glory period, and for Rudolph, it was before homosexuality and abortion was recognized as a acceptable behavior, where he clearly states in his statement here, where I provided the quote, to force society to accept and recognize this behavior as being just as legitimate and normal as a natural man and woman relationship, every effort should be made, including force if necessary, to halt this effort. Moving on to dominion theology. Going back to his statements, once again, Eric Rudolph made it clear that God's saying was above all politics, even saying that at a certain point, the government's authority should not be followed when they have lost their way. Here I provided two quotes where he clearly states the same statement that I mentioned. This took place in July of 1776 when our forefathers decided that the British Crown had violated the essential rights of Englishmen and therefore lost its authority to govern. And when the regime in Washington legalized, sanctioned, and legitimized this practice, they forfeited their legitimacy and moral authority to govern. At various times in history, men and women of good conscience have had to decide when the lawful constituted authorities have overstepped their moral bounds and forfeited their right to rule. Again, he believed that God's words were above secular politics or the law. As for a similar violent act, we have Michael Bray, which had the same belief of just war, where he believed that certain acts of violence were acceptable. It just depended for what purpose it was being acted for. Here he says Christians tend to oppose to violence. Some oppose capital punishment. There's nothing in the scripture to support this view. Violence is immoral, its moral content is determined on the purpose of the violence act. As for a violent act that was different was Barak Goldstein, a Jew that opened fire on Palestine worshippers. This was slightly different compared to the bombings done by Eric Rudolph because of the reasons behind the attacks. Goldstein had overheard Palestinian Arab people say slaughter the Jews and took defensive actions defensive action against the Palestinian Arab people. The difference was that Eric Rudolph was not being discriminated nor was facing hatred from just being a Jew. Though this doesn't justify the violent action that Goldstein took. Looking into the future with the overturn of Roe v. Wade in 2022, there has been talks about whether the overturn of Obergefell versus Hodges will take place in the upcoming years. These types of fears and possible violent interactions between two different groups that believe different things might become more apparent in the upcoming years.